Do you see these?
Yes, we do.
Great. Okay, the Western Cognitive Empire and the Rhetoric of Colonialism, a Scottish case study. When he came to power at the last election, in 2019, the Right Honourable Boris Johnson had Her Majesty the Queen appoint him as the Minister for the Union, a role to be held concurrently with his duties as Prime Minister at Her Majesty's pleasure. In 2020, the Union Unit was established to destabilise the campaign for an independent Scotland, free from London rule. Meanwhile, in Scotland, on January the 19th, 2021, all under one banner, AUOB, which promotes pro-independence marches all across Scotland, posted the following message on Twitter. We will call a protest outside the new UK government colonial building at Edinburgh. Controversy ensued when this post was challenged by Tom Arthur, an elected member of the Scottish Parliament, an MSP, which has limited devolved powers in Scotland. This is what happens when folk get high on their own supply of historically illiterate nonsense. Scotland is not a colony. Both protagonists are important players in the struggle for Scottish independence. The last AUOB march in Edinburgh before the pandemic was attended by 200,000 people. Tom Arthur, MSP, sits for the Scottish National Party, who have governed in Scotland for the last 14 years and are the main political party for Scottish independence. I'm introducing this dispute as a framing mechanism, as evidence that the rhetoric of colonialism is a contentious matter in Scotland in 2021. It provides the opportunity to consider the idea of the Western cognitive empire in the context of Scottish independence as a live political situation. In a context in which most of the participants are both white and Western, what does it mean to talk about decoloniality when the very issue of coloniality is contested, and in which many argue that Scots were fully paid up participants in the Western cognitive empire's worldview? Is it legitimate to invoke the rhetoric of coloniality, decoloniality, post-coloniality? I will suggest that the Scottish case study may be valuable in a wider critique of any who frame the themes of this conference only in terms of the matrices of race or colour, developed or developing world, or ethnic purity contrasted with a civic sovereignty based on territory. The Western cognitive empire depends on the adoption, absorption, and assimilation of its own historiographies, its own narratives, its versions of events, its own deposits, recycled over generations, its home truths. The Western cognitive empire is, as I understand it, perpetuated not by the believability of its narratives, the stories it tells about the data of history, but also about the visibility of such ways of seeing. If there are no contrasting narratives, if there is no contestation, there is no basis for critique. This is more than just saying that history is written by the winners. This is to say that knowing there are other stories is a prerequisite for any critique of the prevailing historiography of the Western cognitive empire. If indigenous people simply go along with the dominant version of events in their then their indigeneity is eroded. But more importantly, the question of decoloniality is rendered invisible through some weird version of Stockholm Syndrome, an emic agreement about the virtue and the value of the dominant version of events. Not teaching history is one effective way of achieving this end. Although I am an indigenous Scot, I went through a Scottish schooling system and have a first degree in history and politics, but I was never taught Scottish history. What I have found is that in the story of Scotland, historians have tended to focus on Scotland either too little or too much. Where historians write about Scotland in the context of the rise of the British Empire, they write about a time in the 18th and 19th and 20th century where the institutions and language of empire were inchoate, fluid, evolving through the economic exploration of Dutch, French, and English East India companies. The formation of the Western cognitive empire assumed a global playing field and discovered Christianity as an ally in both conquest and subjugation. In such globalizing narratives of empire, Scotland is inconsequential. Such texts may contain mention of Scottish imperial soldiers, Scottish imperial administrators, and Scottish trades in goods like cotton and tobacco produced by slaves. But Scotland's geopolitical context as the northern border of England is scarcely dwelt on, because the 1707 Union is part of Scottish history, not empire history. Alternatively, where historians focus on Scotland's incorporating Union of 1707, the global context can slip away, and Scotland's portrayed as a wee, poor, backwards country which succeeds in embracing modernity and empire through unification with its much larger neighbour, England. But the pact in which sovereignty is traded for power also remains simplistic, because it too overlooks contemporary geopolitics by tending to focus on the detail of events and who did what, where, and when. Now, there is no time for a retelling of Scottish history here, but bear with me for a paragraph. The coup, which is never called a coup, in London in 1688, deposed the Catholic King James and installed the Protestant King William from Holland. As a result of this glorious revolution, a prime example of retrospective semantic overlay, England was thrown into 9 years of tribal wars with France on a global basis. And after a 4-year break, a further round of 13 years of war with France and its tribal alliances. The key point is that the English refused to negotiate a union with Scotland. Sorry? Hello? The key point is that the English refused to negotiate it.
Ready to pair.
I think it's muted.
Okay, try again. The key point for the third time is, you'll get this one, is that the English refused to negotiate a union with Scotland in 1667, 1670, 1690, and 1703 to protect their market against the Scots. The difference in 1707, in the midst of a war, was the need to secure the northern English Protestant border against French Catholic invasion, and to secure military access to suppress the followers of the deposed Catholic King James in Scotland. When the English came to negotiate the incorporating Union of 1707, it wasn't on a whim. They came with threats of sanctions against trade and Scots who lived in England. They came with inducements, access to English markets. They came with promises to defend the power of the powerful, the lawyers, the church, the landowners, and they came with the promise of a £400,000 cash bribe. In this takeover, Scots gained 45 seats out of 558 seats in the boardroom of the combined entity, the Parliament in London. A wee bit voice, but no power. A permanent minority, an incorporating union in which Scotland was incorporated. Scottish sovereignty ended because England's strategic interests required the protection of English territorial interests against the Catholic French and the Catholic supporters of the deposed tribal leader, King James. In this version of the story, all the facts remain, but recognizable themes of colonization surface. The idea of a one-size-fits-all model for a colony is naive. Not only did the institutional power structures of imperialism evolve, so did the language. The rhetoric of colonialism includes self-governing colonies, crown colonies, dominions, territories, protectorates, dependencies. These later terms of imperialism are predated by the incorporating union with Scotland in 1707 and a similarly geopolitically defensive anti-Catholic union with Ireland in 1801. These English takeovers are only excluded from the rhetoric of colonialism by a sleight of semantics. The proximity to England, the token representation, the anti-Catholic strategic context may be quite different from, say, the language of empire in India, but Fort William in Scotland and Fort William in Calcutta serve exactly the same purpose: to enforce rule from London. Where the reality of powerlessness is obscured by a debate about imperial terminology, the Western cognitive empire wins. Imperial power resides in the domination of the interpretations of the powerful and the disruption of alternative narratives. The language of imperialism is a slippery fish. The dynamics change, the semantics change, but power always remains in London. Even the name British Empire is fake, a disguise for a locus of power in London, in which the public imagination is taught to buy into a domestic front here and a foreign front over there. The success of the British Empire becomes the success for Britain. But in the 18th and 19th century, Scottish industrialised mills in the town of Paisley converted cotton picked by slaves in America into designs stolen from Kashmir and rebranded as Paisley pattern, undercutting the Indian weavers and putting them out of business. These Scottish mills were operated by displaced Scots agricultural labourers for poor wages and worse conditions as part of a globalisation which transcends domestic and foreign in the interests of capital. The empire was not run from London so much by force, but by collusion. But if force was required, indigenous soldiers colluded. Welcome to the masculinity of the martial races. Whilst the prototypes may have been the Scottish Highlanders, the Sikhs and the Gurkhas were similarly groomed as the expendable stooges of the British Empire. Whilst complicity is uncomfortable, it is exacerbated when transformed into a historiographical competition. In his 2021 book, Empireland, Sathnam Sanghera writes about the British Empire from the point of view of a Sikh from Wolverhampton in England. His broad thesis is that the British Empire is racist on the basis of both ethnicity and skin color. However, Sanghera's story, his best-selling story, provides a contemporary example of how the art of storytelling can fall too readily into avoiding complexity and the challenges of reality. Sanghera is strong on the 1990 massacre of Sikhs at Amritsar, while submitting to mention the Gurkhas who pulled the triggers on the guns. Similarly, the complicity of Sikhs in the East India Company and their role in putting down the Indian Mutiny of 1857 is skated over. Similarly, the Sikh complicity in their construction as a martial race is noted, but analysis of the role and the implications of such collusion in the British Empire is simply absent. By contrast, in a single paragraph, Sanghera feels competent to contemptuously dismiss Scotland for its complicity in the empire, whilst confusingly giving the Irish a free pass as white colonial victims. This presents an awkward problem at the heart of any discussion about colonialism and decoloniality, how we tell our own stories of complicity. Insofar as we begin by arguing about who colluded the most, who is the most pure, the most innocent, the most indigenous, the biggest victims, the most oppressed, we succumb to the imperial strategy of divide and rule. The British Empire was run on the collusion of indigenous people who were both victims and beneficiaries. Beneficiaries because just as the Nazim of the Nazimat in Bengal profited from the East India Company, So it is well documented that the Irish and the Scottish were complicit in both empire and the slave trade, and Sikhs and Gurkhas were recruited. They were not press-ganged as slaves into the imperial army. They fought for the empire on their own volition. The prospect of a historiography in which authors compete in the realm of comparative complicity is invidious. Scots, Sikhs, Gurkhas, the Irish, Bengalis, all have stories to tell, sins to own, but competitive complicity is a post-colonial error. The beneficiary of such a mind game is naturally the Western cognitive empire and its propensity to divide and rule. I'm not advocating some glorious solidarity between the oppressed people of the world, because such an idea quickly loops back into definitional languaging, semantic difficulties, and the ambiguity of what is meant by oppression. If intersectionality is taught as anything, it is that oppression operates not just at an ethnic or territorial or imperial level, but within the cultural and interpersonal relationships between women and men around age, disability, gender, sexuality, as well as race. The challenge is not to smooth over difference, but to recognize that difference and diversity arise from the stories people tell about themselves, their lived understanding of their own situations. And as Sangera shows, it is easy to tell one's own story in a way which glosses over one's own complicity and collusion, or to judge without listening enough to other people's stories to understand their historical situations. It is like the manipulation of data on a chart. The impact differs depending not only on the data points presented, but on the time periods chosen. While the Scots were incorporated into England in 1707, that was nearly 100 years before Ranjit Singh even founded the Sikh Empire in 1799. History is a long game, and synchronic comparisons of oppression are literally anachronistic. So, is Scotland a colony or not? I suggest this is an irrelevant question because it hands power to academics and politicians who control the definitions of the processes of categorization. The language and methods of colonialism are dynamic and inherently designed to categorize and conquer, to divide and rule. I suggest a more straightforward approach to analysis is the analysis of power. Even after the devolution settlement, which was designed to take the oxygen out of independence back in 1999, Scotland still lacks power over broadcasting, constitutional affairs, immigration policy, energy strategy, equal opportunities, trade and industry, foreign policy, defence and security, economic policy, borrowing powers, monetary policy, taxation, social security and pensions, telecoms, including the broadband, which brings me to you. In the 21st century, we live in Scotland in an interconnected world where sovereignty is always limited or shared, depending on your perspective, and control can never be taken back. This was the slogan of the Brexiteers in England who dragged Scotland out of the European Union against the will of 62% who voted to remain. The last time Scotland returned a majority of votes for a Conservative government was in 1955, but it is the current Conservative government in 2021 which decides the policies which shape Scotland's future. It is this disjunct between democracy and power which legitimizes the recourse to the rhetoric of colonialism by Scots. This powerlessness is what most Scots now see. This is what most Scots now feel. We sense that we are governed by people who do not have our interests in their hearts. And this result will be reflected in 3 weeks' time in the Scottish elections of the 6th of May, where independence is the primary issue. This is a conclusion which both All Under One Banner and Tom Arthur, MSP, agree on. The difference is not about the present, it is about how they each tell the story of the past, and more particularly where they begin that story, in the 18th century with the invention of Great Britain, or in the 1950s, when most Scots had subsumed their Scottish identity within their British identity. I have told you a version of this story. You don't need to agree with me. But what I know is that the Union Unit benefits by dividing the independence movement over issues such as this in order to perpetuate London rule. Although the contours of this argument are Scottish, my hope, excuse me, that's my time on the last paragraph. My hope is that this case study glancingly reveals the challenges and abstractions such as Western cognitive empire. Scotland so obviously exists within that framing. Scots are predominantly Westerners. 92% of Scots report themselves to be white. Some Scots have willingly contributed to the development of both modernity and the British Empire. Most Scots accept a mixed economy in which entrepreneurs want to profit from the sale of goods and services and are willing to engage with our English neighbours, with the European Union, with the giant US tech companies, whilst retaining socialised medical services and free education, which now teaches Scottish history at school. The nationalism of the Scottish National Party is not based on ethnicity, but territory. It is not focused on our past, but on how we can live a better, more socially just life in the world as we find it. But at this crucial time in our independence struggle, the rhetoric of colonialism contributes to a description of who we are and the powerlessness we feel. I share this case study as a contribution to highlight the complexity inherent in the themes of this conference, and I hope that I and other Scots can learn from your experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saville-Smith. And just as a side note, at least part of how I ended up as a colonizer where I am in Denver is because my part of my family was run out of Scotland after 1707, fleeing the British and over into Canada and then down to Denver where we are now. So I especially appreciate the presentation. Do we have any questions for Dr. Saville-Smith?
Could you say something more about the fact that the British Empire really shouldn't be called an empire?
Oh, no, it's not that it shouldn't be called an empire. It shouldn't be called British.
Okay, can you say more about that? Yeah.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Great remark.
Yeah,
I'd like to hear the historical nuance.
Yeah. The British Empire is obviously a British Empire, but the point I'm trying to make is that the name the British Empire is effectively a con that is perpetrated on the people that live in Great Britain. Yeah, because the British Empire has never been run on behalf of or for the benefit of the people of Great Britain. The British Empire has always been run and operated on behalf of, first of all, its proxies, the East India Company, and subsequently, when the East India Company failed, particularly in India after the 1957 first independence struggle in India, it's been run on behalf of a coterie of people in London who are basically run power. Now, this depends on your idea of democracy and the fact that between the founding of the East India Company in 1600 and the demise of what we call the British Empire after the Second World War, I suppose, though it becomes the Commonwealth and so on and so forth, is that this is a long period of time. And the nature and the structure and the role of democracy changes over that period of time. The point I'm trying to illustrate, make clear within this is that whilst fully owning Scots' complicity within the British Empire, Scots' control within the British Empire has always been negligible.
Well, I mean, it's in some ways that brings up a whole question about the logic of empire and the logic of empire and essentially being a form of global political economy with the emphasis on economy. My own studies in neoliberalism, have convinced me that you might say that empire is very often an economic racket with a political justification or a cultural mystique to go along with it and so forth. And so that makes a lot of sense. That's very persuasive. It would be just interesting how this comes into the discussion of decoloniality. It's very often we talk about coloniality, we talk about language, and we talk about land, which is sort of the question I wanted to raise in the last thing. Is like we have the whole question of economy, and we also have the question of religion, which Mignolo has been critiqued for, as he doesn't really address religion as being, sort of the symbolic matrix for the cultural justification of empire or hegemony in the original sense of the word, that it was, that was used in the Marxist context. So, but, I also have Scotch ancestry, not as much as Roger. It's not my name, but half of my father was Scottish immigrants, and of course I've never studied the history of that. The whole question of the Scots in America and the whole Scottish diaspora, which is not something contemporary, but something historical. The question is, to what degree does that also follow the whole notion of or the logic of empire?
That question is beyond the scope of my paper. I can do it, but I think I need another 30 minutes. I think within the points you make, I think actually one of the most interesting points is the relationship of religion, which tends to get very squeezed out in a discussion, particularly of the British Empire, because it tends to be the British Empire is somehow located within non-Christian contexts, primarily is often considered within non-Christian contexts, so that the focus of the what I call the tribal wars between England and France, which are governed by the matrices of Catholicism and Protestantism, and the nature of the incorporation of Scotland, which is governed by the threat of French Catholicism and the threat of Catholicism, Catholic followers of the deposed King James II and his lineage, who become the Jacobites, which leads into the 1745 rebellion and the previous rebellions prior to that, which leads into the deconstruction of the Highlands and leads into the diaspora that you're discussing. All of these things are, completely and utterly interconnected, but tend to get washed out in what I was trying to identify is the fact that empire history tends to exist over here, and Scottish history tends to exist over here, and they tend not to be seen as part of the same historical processes because of the nature of the way historians divide up the academy.